You're a loser, you're a coward, you're a nobody, you're an animal.
These are relatives of victims of the Green River Killer.
May God have mercy on your pathetic soul, because the rest of us who know the truth about you won't.
The most prolific serial murderer America has ever known.
The one thing that I want you to know, I was that daughter at home, waiting for my mom to come home.
Whose 19-year reign of terror left the area surrounding Seattle littered with corpses.
I don't wish for him to die. I wish for him to have a long, suffering, cruel death.
But who was the Green River Killer? And was he born to kill?
When he went through the door and left to go to work, he wasn't the man that I knew.
The old Highway 99, adjacent to Seattle's SeaTac Airport. 30 years ago, a notorious spot.
This area, back in the early 80s, had a very transient population. There were topless bars over here. There were a lot of hotels where you could rent rooms for an hour or two.
Faye Brooks, then a detective assigned to sex crime cases, was regularly called to the street known simply as the Strip.
There were a lot of young women who were working the streets.
All the girls were young, and some of them had troubled past, but all of them are somebody's daughter and somebody's sister.
A lot of the young girls had grown up in abusive homes, and that was why they were running away. And I could relate to that. I'm a survivor of child sex abuse, and there but for the grace of God were I, and so I could certainly empathize with them, and I also wanted to help them.
One such woman was Marsha Chapman, a street worker who claimed to have been raped.
And the apartment building where she lived was right here.
Marsha was a beautiful, statuesque black woman. She was 31. She had 3 children. She couldn't support them on the job she could get, and she was working as a prostitute.
She was living in an apartment that was sparsely furnished, so I think she was like down on her luck. She seemed to have a kind heart and was a nice person, but under the circumstances, she did what she had to do to make ends meet.
Marsha's alleged rape was typical of the hazards working girls on the Strip faced. At the time, best-selling crime writer Ann Rule lived just blocks from the area.
I would sometimes stop and warn them and say, do you know what I do for a living? I write about murder. And you don't have a chance out here. How do you know who you're getting in with? And usually they would just shrug and walk away.
In 1982, the dangers of working the Strip would be brought home by a discovery in the nearby Green River.
There was a man on the water in a boat, and he saw underneath the water what he thought was a mannequin. It wasn't a mannequin, it was a human being, and there were 2 of them there. Well, one of the victims in the water, her hand was just waving with the current of the water. And it was like, here I am, please help me. but of course it was too late.
As police investigated the crime scene, they made another grim find.
Processing the scene where the victims were in the water was where we found the third victim on the banks.
They were all within a few feet of each other, and so clearly, the same killer had put all three of the bodies there.
All three women had been picked up from around the strip by what the FBI dubbed an organized serial killer.
The organized offender was more planned, more premeditated, was able to conceptualize crimes and carry them out very efficiently, mainly because of the fact that they had very little feeling for another human being. They looked at a victim as an object for their excitement. Basically, you're talking about a sexual psychopath.
The victims were 16-year-old Opal Mills, 17-year-old Cynthia Jean Hines, and 31-year-old Marcia Chapman.
When I found out that it was Marcia, I don't think I had any words that I could say. It was like, oh my God, somebody killed her. It was really sad.
We did not know this was only the beginning of a reign of terror, and we wouldn't know who was doing this for a very long time.
On Seattle's Strip, the Green River Killer had found a rich hunting ground that would enable him to amass a body count unrivaled by any serial killer in American history. By autumn of 1982, the bodies of 5 young women had been discovered in or beside Seattle's Green River. They had disappeared from a notorious highway known as the Strip, an area where prostitution was rife. And the Green River Killer had only just begun. On the 15th of September 1982, 18-year-old Mary Bridget Meehan vanishes.
Bridget was the much-loved daughter of a Catholic family in Bellevue, a very rich suburb of Seattle. She skipped school a lot. She joined up with a boyfriend named Ray, and they were living in a cheap motel on Highway 99. She left. I think she was still possibly turning a few tricks, and she didn't come back. Her family was so upset because she was 8.5 months pregnant.
To every serial killer, human beings are objects. There's no emotional connection. There's nothing there.
On the 20th of September, another girl, 15-year-old Deborah Lorraine Estes, disappeared. Yet police were still unable to identify a killer.
This was the area that I was working in. This is the area where the bulk of the Green River victims were picked up from. And we would sit here and look, trying to identify who might be the suspect. We had very dedicated detectives who were determined to solve this case.
On the 26th of September, 16-year-old Linda Jane Rule vanishes.
Linda Rule was a slender blonde girl who lived up in the North End. She had been working the streets, and she had a boyfriend who kind of served as a pimp. She disappeared from an area near the Northgate Mall. Like all serial killers, he seemed to have the ability to sense vulnerability in potential victims. He didn't take the streetwise girls. He was looking for the younger women.
By the end of 1982, 15 girls would be missing or found dead, and pressure was mounting on the sheriff's task force.
People hoped that law enforcement would be successful. There were different rumors that were passing around of who the person might be. There was rampant speculation that it might be even a law enforcement officer because of the easy access that the individual had to the number and variety of women in the community.
You know, the unfortunate thing is some of the women of the street felt like the sheriff's office wasn't investigating the case as hard as we could have because they were street kids and runaways, and that's not true. Everybody assigned to that investigation was committed to solving it, committed to bringing this person to justice, because these were, you know, somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, somebody's mother, and we cared about them. We cared about them like they were our own kids or our own family members, and we wanted to solve it.
Then, on the 30th of April 1983, a young girl was spotted being taken from the strip.
Maria Malvar with her boyfriend were at a restaurant on the highway. Her boyfriend went to make a phone call. When he came back, Maria wasn't in the restaurant. And he was very concerned, and he thought, well, I'll go out on the highway and see if I can find her. And he realized that Maria was in the truck ahead of him. There was a man driving, and then she was talking to the man. And so he determined to follow the truck because he wasn't sure what was going on. He worried about her. And they got up to the stoplight at Highway 99 and 216th. But when he turned left, he couldn't see the car.
Marie's boyfriend returned with her family to search the streets for the pickup truck she'd left in. And in a quiet cul-de-sac, just a few blocks from the strip, they found it, parked outside the modest home of a local truck painter.
And they asked local police, please, to go there because they believed Maria was in that house. One of the sergeants did go there, knocked on the door, a man answered, and he said, there's nobody here but me. And they didn't press it.
All serial killers have the ability to appear so normal that they throw off even people who are considered experts. The serial killer is the Olympiad of the pathological liar.
The man's details joined hundreds more in the task force's files. A saliva swab would later be added. Still, girls continued to vanish.
And the list kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
By June 1983, at least 26 girls had disappeared.
They learn from their crimes. As their murders grow in number, their efficiency increases.
The remains were being found in secluded, quiet, dark areas.
That summer, 5 girls went missing.
By the time they're up to 5 or 6 or 10 homicides, they become very difficult to catch.
The fear was tremendous and deep throughout the entire community.
Autumn, 5 more vanished.
Some of them were in the mountain foothills, some of them were down in the Green River Valley.
He was, you know, ahead of us. We wanted to catch him. We wanted to stop him.
Winter and spring 1984, 4 more girls gone.
There would be 3 or 4, or maybe even 5 in one spot.
Unbelievable.
He was outsmarting the homicide detectives. Everybody was looking for him.
He was dumping women like they were garbage. This was a gun site. It's not far from the airport. It's not far from the strip where the young girls were missing. In the evenings, it was dark, very secluded. Very few people came down here. You could come, dump something, and be gone. And that's what happened in this location here. They were just dumped.
Among the dozens of bodies found was the 16-year-old Linda Jane Rule, her skeletal remains hidden under a bush. And in the scrubland south of the airport, the fate of the pregnant 18-year-old Mary Bridget Meehan was finally discovered.
someone raped her, killed her, and buried her and her unborn baby in a shallow grave on the west side of the highway.
By spring 1984, the killer had amassed more than 40 victims. But then something changed.
The killings appeared to have stopped. Many thought that he was gone.
It's incredibly unusual for a serial killer simply to stop killing. A serial killer will usually only cease murder when he's apprehended or when he dies himself.
In 1985, the truck painter from the house in the quiet cul-de-sac began dating 40-year-old divorced mother, Judith.
When I first met him, I thought he was quite the gentleman and so polite and nice. He loved the country music and the dancing. And he was always smiling. He never got angry. And I just thought he was the greatest. It was like love at first sight.
Within months, the house became Judith's home.
He offered to help me move and that I could move in with him if I like. There was no carpet in his house, so he let me pick out some carpet. He had previous renters in there. And he had told me that the little one had wet on the carpet. The house needed a woman's touch.
After 3 years living together, the couple wed.
We were married in 1988. It seemed like the perfect marriage, and so he was good to my daughters, played with my grandchildren. My dreams are coming true.
Judith would enjoy 13 happy years of marriage, while most of the world forgot about the Green River Killer. Most, that is, except the men and women of the Green River Task Force. And in 2001, advances in DNA profiling enabled them to compare samples taken from the early victims, including Marcia Chapman, with swabs that had been taken from several men questioned during the investigation.
This is the DNA from Marcia Chapman, and this is the DNA from the Green River Killer. And we looked at them and we're like, they're the same. They're the same. Scary which way?
I couldn't believe it. I was just devastated and in shock, and I think I went into denial. I wasn't believing it.
Only now would the world discover the shocking truth about Judith's husband, Gary Ridgway, the most prolific serial killer in US history. During the 1980s, the mysterious Green River Killer had prowled the red light district of Seattle's Strip unchecked, amassing a terrifying body count. In 2001, a DNA match had connected 52-year-old truck painter Gary Ridgway with the first few victims.
He'd been identified as the most prolific serial killer in the history of the United States. Each of us recognized that this would be the biggest criminal case in the history of the state of Washington.
The prosecution and defense teams would now be able to interview the man suspected of over 4 dozen homicides.
I'm walking down a corridor and I'm going to open the door and be introduced to the supposed Green River Killer. 100 things are going through your mind and wondering, what is it going to be? Mean? Is he going to be crying? Is he going to be crazy? and I walked in and like, wow, this isn't what I expected.
How are you? Pretty good.
All of us kind of looked at each other and said, that's the guy that's been eluding everybody for 20 years?
What was remarkable was that he was so normal.
Sleep okay?
No, no.
Well, that didn't look like the Hilton in there. I got a glimpse of it.
Well, it had a Posturepedic mattress in there, so it was here, so that was good.
Okay.
Yeah, a little bit hot in there, but...
If you did not know what he had done, you would like him. The monster within him was well hidden.
People want to ascribe extraordinary traits and qualities to these people. These are, for the most part, very ordinary individuals, except for the extraordinary crime that they get involved in.
So who was the suspected Green River Killer? Gary Ridgway was born in 1949, the middle of 3 boys. He lived in a small house, not far from the Strip.
His mom was kind of stay-at-home and then part-time. She worked at a department store. His dad drove a bus for the county.
Gary sometimes would ride with him on the bus, and his dad would say, you know, see her, she's a prostitute, she's, you know, the scum of the earth, and would berate prostitutes and talk about how filthy and bad they were. And then there are a couple of episodes where Gary recalls him leaving him in the vehicle while Dad went and had sex with a prostitute.
School friend Terry Rochelle recalls that Gary Ridgway was more inward than his siblings.
His brother was very outgoing and, you know, a bright personality, and Gary was more quiet and withdrawn, I would say is a good word. He was just a little pipsqueak guy, just, you know, somebody's little brother, basically, you know, you didn't pay a whole lot of attention to him. Just kind of in the shadows, I would say, most of his life.
At school, the struggling Ridgway failed to make an impression. However, at parents' evenings, his mother Mary did.
All the women kind of sat back and looked at her. It was strange because she would wear a big bouffant hairdo and lots of makeup, short skirts, which were not really the style in those days, especially for a mom. She just always seemed like she was trying to be very glamorous and not like our moms at all.
I always remember her wearing kind of the
really
tight shorts and low cut tops and longer hair. She was very attractive lady.
Ridgway admitted wetting the bed throughout his childhood and well into his teens.
When he would wet the bed, his mother would put him had him get in the bathtub and wash him and wash his genitals.
During one bath, her robe fell open and she was naked underneath, and he felt arousal at that, and at the same time knew that it probably wasn't a good thing to feel, but he felt it.
He talked about having some sexual feelings towards her. He described in some detail watching her when she was in a bathing suit and looking at her and thinking that she dressed pretty provocatively.
This overly sexualized person washing her son's genitals, and you realize that most teenage boys are having an awful time with dealing with their own emerging sexuality, has to have had an impact on some way.
Boys need to see their mothers as asexual. It is very, very destabilizing for an adolescent boy to see his mother in a sexual manner. It's very hard for an adolescent boy to imagine his mother having sex with anybody, including his father. And so when a mother behaves in a sexualized or hyper-sexualized way, it's very unsettling for an adolescent boy.
As Ridgway got older, he started showing signs of destructive behavior, starting fires, and as a teenager, he took his first step towards murder.
He approached a first grader, a 6-year-old boy that he saw playing in a lot near his house, The boy was dressed up playing cowboys and Indians, and he kind of lured him into the bushes and completely unprovoked stabbed the little boy in the stomach and nearly killed him. He told the boy that he just wanted to know what it felt like to kill somebody. And after he stabbed him, he took the knife and kind of wiped the blade off on the little boy's shoulder, and just walked away. And actually, nobody ever connected him to that.
Serial killers need to have some concrete proof of what they're doing. I mean, you can think about something, but until you've done it, you don't know how it's going to turn out. And so what the serial killer does is experiment. Often they will commit an act like a trial run.
Ridgway eventually finished school 2 years late due to his slow progress. The following year, age 21, he married his steady girlfriend and joined the Navy.
When he returned from his deployment to the Philippines, his wife admitted that she had had an affair with a friend of theirs. That was when he first started kind of referring to her as a whore and using other derogatory terms. And that was kind of the beginning of a series of relationships that never quite panned out for him.
During the early 1970s, Ridgway got a job spray painting at the Kenworth truck manufacturers. He then met and married his second wife.
He was very much into having sex, often, repeatedly, throughout the day, as frequently, pretty much as women would agree.
They would go out in the truck, and he loved to have sex in public where they could be discovered at any time.
But after having a child, their relationship deteriorated.
His wife left him when his son was about 5, and that really hurt him. And that was when he started to go frequent prostitutes.
Ridgway claimed he became addicted to prostitutes. He had in fact been quizzed by police about his activities on the Strip several times during the 80s, even passing a lie detector test when grilled about the Green River murders.
When your subject is someone without a conscience, who has no regrets and no remorse and no real concern, they can pass them.
He was a magnificent liar. He had an ability just to go and talk, and he would just talk and tell stories, and I for a while, I assumed they were true.
And when I would go in to visit Gary at the jail, he would tell me that everything's okay. He didn't do it. He didn't hurt those women. He didn't kill them. He didn't. And I would believe him.
As he was questioned in 2001, Ridgway continued to protest his innocence.
Up to this point, Gary had been maintaining that they had the wrong person, that he had had sex with many prostitutes, he hadn't killed any, and that was essentially going to be the defense.
But when forensic evidence surfaced, tying him to 3 more victims, Ridgway's story changed.
Myself and another attorney were in the meeting room waiting for Mr. Ridgway. I don't recall what we were talking about, but we both had smiles on our faces when he walked in. And he said, "Oh, you won't be smiling when we're done. I've been lying to you all. I've been manipulating everyone for all these years. I killed them all."
Only now would investigators discover the true shocking horror of the Green River Killer's crimes. In 2003, 54-year-old truck painter Gary Ridgway admitted he was the Green River Killer that had eluded capture for almost 2 decades. A man responsible for the murder of more than 4 dozen women. Faced with the death penalty, Ridgway offered to tell the truth about all his crimes in return for his life. On behalf of the victims' families, who wanted to know the fate of their loved ones, the prosecution agreed. Ridgway would now reveal the true horror of his crimes. Investigators now learned how the Green River Killer had so easily abducted and killed his victims, even at the height of the public terror.
He came across as being a very meek and mild, safe person. As a matter of fact, in one situation, he had his child in the car with him when he picked up a prostitute.
He looks like a mousy little man. He doesn't look like the kind of person that, if you were a prostitute, that you would be afraid of.
They thought, well, he's a family man, he's safe, and turns out he wasn't.
He preferred to take them to his house. Some said no to that, and they would drive to a remote location, and he had a pickup truck with a canopy on the back. And he would convince them to go into the back of the canopy so they could have more room to have sex. But what he would do is, once he got them in the position, either in his bed at home, where he had pictures of his son on the wall and they felt a little more secure, or whether they were just hopping in the back of the truck, get naked, begin with oral sex. A missionary at some point convinced them that he would be able to finish sooner if they would agree to the rear entry position.
When I got through having a climax with her, I jumped on her.
He had his arm around the girl's neck.
How much are you pulling on her neck?
I'm pulling really hard on her neck.
How?
Just like this.
What are you saying to her?
Don't fight, and I'll let you go.
And then choke them with his forearm.
I'm feeling, I gotta kill her, I gotta kill her, I gotta kill her. You'll need to go up to kind of like on the top of the hill on this and pull in.
Ridgway guided the investigators to where he dumped dozens of young women.
I just drove in my pickup and camper and parked it, brought her body over and put it a little bit over the hill.
His method of recollection was where he had left their bodies.
Between this one and that one up there, you think you put like
five of them in there.
Okay.
He essentially said the victims didn't mean anything. I have no idea who they are. I don't know if they're black, if they're white, how old they are, how young they are. I mean, they really meant nothing to me as an individual.
What you're getting is what you're gonna get, and it's all you can get because I don't remember.
To every serial killer, human beings are objects. In the homicides that they commit, they're never going to remember the name. They're never going to remember the face. They'll remember the concrete action of where those bodies are.
One of the dump sites that Ridgway identified was that of Marie Malvar, the 18-year-old whose boyfriend had spotted Ridgway abducting her. He admitted that when he strangled her, she had fought back harder than any of his victims.
I put battery acid myself right here and there to cover up scratches. So there's a scratch here, scratches here from Milvar.
Ridgway claimed he was filled with rage and had wanted to hurt his victims even after their deaths. He admitted he'd tried to set the lifeless 16-year-old Linda Rule's hair on fire.
You know, he seemed throughout the interviews to try to blame a lot of what had happened on the women in his life. That the women that he actually killed were kind of an extension of all the women before who had disappointed him in some way.
All the pressure just built and built and built and built. My releasing point was killing women.
He did talk about a number of the victims that he would go back and have sexual relations with them for a number of days after he killed them.
Gary, and did you revisit any of these?
I revisited at least one of them.
And when we say revisit, what did you come back to do?
Have sex with her.
He's like, oh, yeah, you know, but then the flies would come and the maggots, and then I'd be like, oh, I don't, you know, like he didn't want to do it after that. You know, you were just, I mean, that's the thing. He said it in this, like I'm talking to you, but as if it's totally normal.
Now, why do individuals do this? The standard explanation for necrophilia had been sex with someone dead. You can have total control over it. There's no resistance at all. And so you can live out those sorts of feelings with a dead, lifeless body.
He's not the one that you're going to turn to and ask, why did you do this, and get the deep psychological answer. But one of the things that frequently came up was that he wouldn't have to pay for the sex.
Ridgway's murderous spree had continued unabated until he met his third wife, Judith, in the mid-80s.
Gary was so straight, normal, and loving and gentle. He was so kind around me all the time. He didn't get mad or upset about anything. It seemed like the perfect marriage.
When he first met her, he stopped patronizing prostitutes and stopped killing. And then, as he put it, he fell off the wagon.
Gary would call home and say that, you know, he's going to be late coming home, so he's going to grab a bite to eat, grab a hamburger, and, you know, he'll be late. When I think back now, that was probably one time when he was out picking up someone off of the Highway 99 strip.
And then he killed again.
Right in here's where I killed her. Right in here.
How far in?
20 feet.
He would tell me he'd call home and say he's going to stop at the junkyard on the way home from work. And then when he got home, he didn't really have any parts from the, so that may have been another occasion.
And so, after having killed maybe 60 girls from 82 to 85, from 85 to when he was caught in 2001, the number of victims was more like 10 or 11.
Mr. Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 1?
Guilty.
In 2003, Gary Ridgway made his plea to the 48 charges of murder that investigators could conclusively tie him to.
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 5?
Guilty.
When he confessed, and when I sat and listened to him say guilty.
Mr. Ridgway, how do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree for the death of Marcia Chapman?
Guilty.
After every one of the names that they had said.
For the death of Mary B. Meehan?
Guilty.
I just sat there and cried, and that's when it finally sunk in that this is real. He did it. There's someone else inside of him when he went through the door and left to go to work. He wasn't the man that I knew.
Count 19 for the death of Linda Rule.
Guilty.
I would think back and think about all those years that I was with him. Were they real? Or was he just using me?
How do you plead to the charge of aggravated murder in the first degree as charged in count 48?
Guilty.
I lived with him all those years. He could have killed me. He could have killed my daughters. He could have killed my grandbabies.
So what made the monster? Was it his unusual upbringing? Or was Gary Ridgway born to kill?
I still don't believe that any child is born to kill. But I think some children have a predisposition to violence. If the child grows up in a safe place for them, where they feel loved, where they attach, we're never going to know that that predisposition for violence is there. But if that child is born into a home where they're afraid, where they're neglected, where they're abused, then you have the perfect soil to grow a serial killer.
I think that a boy and his mother have a certain relationship, and when that relationship is different, then I think that's when we start seeing those kind of switches turning on and off.
This is one of my ominous signs. She was somewhat seductive and so on. These sorts of unhealthy relationships with a maternal figure.
People that I've encountered that I've prosecuted for murder, I think that their circumstances have driven them to do what they have done in the majority of cases that I have handled, I would say. I did not see that in Ridgway. I truly believed that he was born that way, hardwired that way, whatever you want to say.
The Green River Killer was definitely born to kill. He was an individual who has this changed gene and culminated in a tremendous number and intensity of homicides.
His brain is definitely wired differently. He's a psychopath. That has to be a brain miswiring from the beginning.
I don't know about the nurture-nature piece. I think at some point it's a decision. And I think we all have some propensities for violence, but you can decide, you can control it. And he decided how he wanted to control it.
19 years after Marcia Chapman's body was discovered beneath the surface of the Green River, Gary Ridgway was sentenced to serve 48 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole.
In the end, Marcia got her justice because it was DNA found on her that they could match with Gary Ridgway. And Marcia got her day.
That was a good day. It was a good day.
Before Ridgway was led away, Judge Richard Jones instructed him to face the victims' families.
There's a tremendous amount of emotion that these family members wanted to pour out for Gary Ridgway to hear.
I can only hope someone gets the opportunity to choke you unconscious so you can live through the horror that you put our daughters, our sisters, our mothers through.
The pain would not go away, but it brought them closure.
The one thing that I want you, Gary Ridgway, to know, I was that daughter at home, waiting for my mom to come home.
I think for all of us, as we brought the families up and introduced them, it was really emotional.
I recall Linda Rule's father.
There are people here that hate you. I'm not one of them.
Was very sympathetic, very compassionate individual.
What God says to do, and that's to forgive all. So you are forgiven, sir.
On one hand, I'm sitting next to a person who's done the most inhumane things to other human beings, and then 15 feet away is a person doing the most humane and merciful thing.
I wanted him to look out, see the pain, see the anger, and see all the agony that he had caused in his lifetime. I wanted him to take that visual image with him back to prison. So for the balance of his life, that would be the last public image that he had.
You took from me my firstborn child. May her soul and the soul of the other 47 victims rest in peace.
"5'4", Donald Pee Wee Gaskins would earn himself the title, the meanest man in America.
If you had a business dispute, you'd sue him. Pee Wee'd kill him.
A serial killer who, if he's to be believed, was responsible for over 100 cruel and sickening murders.
Right over here is where he drowned Doreen, and then he hit the baby in the back of the head and hatchet after he had raped her. The total amount is 105 people.
A man who wouldn't stop killing, even on death row.
When he plugs that son of a bitch up, it'll blow him on into hell.
It was just kind of astonishing that all that was able to happen in the penitentiary.
So what made Pee Wee the man he was? And was he born to kill?
My daddy, he called himself a vampire. He would have to see blood.
(1975). Schoolteacher Mary Ann Dunham reports the disappearance of one of her students, 13-year-old Kim Gelkins.
Kim was in a class of fifth graders, most of whom were 10 or 11 years old, but she was 13, as I recall. She was quiet, petite. Her mother had died, I think, the previous spring. I think she was lonely for her mother and sad, you know, so she was looking for somebody to pay attention to her. Often at the beginning of the school year, teachers want to assess their class writing skills, and so sometimes you'll assign them to write about what they did on their summer vacation or whatever. And that particular year, I remember asking my children to write about the person they admired most. And Kim wrote about someone who was named Donna Gaskins.
Donna Gaskins was the common-law wife of a colourful local criminal, Donald Pee Wee Gaskins.
Pee Wee has always been known as a notorious person in our area. I think you would have to say he came over as different, because how many people do you know that drive a hearse for their vehicle?
It was a long black hearse, just, you know, like they used to, you know, drive a long time ago. And on the very back, he had a little sign that says, "I haul dead bodies." Everybody joked about it, you know, everybody just, you know, thought it was funny.
He always told people that he hauled bodies in it, but people didn't pay much attention to him. But while they didn't pay attention to him, they were still scared of him in the lower end of the county. Everybody, if you talked about Pee Wee, they sort of would run and hide because they were just scared of him. He had that kind of reputation.
Gaskin's daughter, Shirley, remembers the day Kim Gelkins vanished.
Her mom had died, and she got to be friends with Daddy because Daddy was living in Charleston. She was a sweet little girl. We had just come back from the park, and my mother-in-law lived next door, and the children was going to go over there to get something to eat. So I said, well, go on over there, and I'll be there in a minute. And when I went over there, I said, where's Kim? Nobody had seen Kim. And she just walked out the door and disappeared. And Daddy said, well, you know, don't worry about it. She probably run away.
Kim was not the only missing person. 5 years earlier, in 1970, Shirley's cousin, Janice Kirby, had vanished.
Janice and I mean, when we were little, we did everything together. She was a sweet girl, very smart girl, very good in school. I mean, and she was just, you know, all-American country girl, When she first disappeared, everybody said that, you know, she'd run away from home. We were all out looking for her, you know, searching for her. Everybody was calling everybody that they knew to, you know, try to find her. But, you know, after 6, 7 months, we knew something wasn't right.
Now, detectives investigating the new disappearance began to focus on Shirley's father, Donald Pee Wee Gaskins.
Some of our field agents were working on rumors that had been surfacing, working along with detectives from Charleston in an attempt to find Kim Gelkins.
We started looking for the Gelkins girl, and of course we did not have Pee Wee at the time, but we did have an individual who was running with Pee Wee at the time. We did pick Walter Neely up, and after a lot of talking and everything, Walter finally took the investigators out and showed them where he had helped Pee Wee bury someone.
They knew somebody was buried there. We didn't have any idea what we were going to find until we started digging.
We took probably, I guess, 10 or 12, 15 deputies and sled agents, and we just lined up and started walking slowly into the woods. Sometime during that process, in moving through the bushes, the undergrowth, somebody discovered that there were some bushes that had been put there that weren't growing there. We had metal probes that were maybe 3 feet long with a T-handle on top, a piece of rebar with a point on it, that you could determine soil consistency. You probe along, and then it goes down.
They probed around enough to where they could tell that there was someone buried there. So we sealed the area off and started digging. And it turned up that we found 6 bodies buried there. Yeah, it was a pretty gruesome scene. I guess I was overwhelmed because, you know, I had been in law enforcement for some 12 and a half years prior to this, and I'd never seen anything of that magnitude.
But the discovery of the 6 bodies was just the beginning of a shocking tale that would lead to claims that Gaskins was the most prolific serial killer in US history. In 1975, the disappearance of 13-year-old schoolgirl Kim Gelkins had led detectives to a burial site in the woods of South Carolina. There, investigators, including Sheriff William Barnes,
It would have been right there by that tree. That's where it would have been.
would make a shocking discovery.
This is the area where the 6 bodies were recovered. I have not been back here since everything happened back in 1976. The graves would have all been within probably 25 foot of each other. They would have all been right in this area here where we're standing now, under this tree.
All 6 had been murdered and buried 2 apiece in 3 shallow graves. And all 6 were linked to notorious character Donald Pee Wee Gaskins, a diminutive local car thief who drove an old hearse and boasted of having his own private cemetery. No one had believed him.
I was 6 months pregnant at the time with my last child. And we were, you know, when the cops came up there, and, you know, they were telling me, oh, you know, that they were looking for my daddy for murder and stuff like that. I mean, I went in shock. I went into labor. My baby was born, I wasn't even 7 months pregnant. She didn't weigh, but she weighed 2 pounds and something.
All of a sudden, we found ourselves in the national limelight.
I was one of the first reporters on the scene, and I got a lot of it firsthand. And it was just, to me, it was so shocking. That's pretty wild, and that's hard to believe in South Carolina. You don't find stuff like that around here.
Investigators now had to uncover the identity of the victims.
The ones we initially found were in very good condition. Apparently they'd been put in the ground in a cold time of the year, so that adipocia had occurred where the fatty tissue sort of turns to like a soap-like material that's firmer and keeps the shape and consistency of the skin and the underlying tissue.
I've never been a smoker, but the smell of decaying flesh was so intense in that area that the smoke from the cigars diminished that smell enough to where you could stand it.
In the first grave were 25-year-old Dennis Bellamy and his 15-year-old half-brother Johnny Knight. Both had been involved in an auto theft ring with Gaskins.
Daddy said they were going to steal a car, and they came by the house, and I had just cooked some biscuit and coffee, and they ate some biscuit and coffee, and they left, and I never seen them again.
We took them down into the woods and went to a big oak tree and sort of pointed up in the tree and was telling them how they could use that to throw a chain horse over to pull engines out of the car and dispose of stolen property. This would be the tree where he brought the two fellows out and pointed up to the limb, talking about how they could horse the motors out of stolen vehicles here. As they were looking up in the tree, he shot one of them in the back of the head, and then when the other one ran, he shot him. This is where he shot him, right here.
If he'd think that they were gonna, they were getting tired or they was gonna tell on him, then he'd get rid of them.
The other 4 victims, 2 men and 2 women, were all people Gaskins thought had wronged him or might betray him. But none of the 6 bodies found was that of missing schoolgirl Kim Gelkins. Gaskins was arrested trying to flee the area. Faced with the prospect of the death penalty for his crimes, he struck a deal to lead investigators to further bodies. At an area known as Alligator Landing, he admitted to burying 23-year-old family friend Doreen Dempsey and her 2-year-old daughter, Robin.
Doreen Dempsey and Robin were both skeletonized because they were very close to the surface. They were not really buried deeply. That child had some injuries to the head that we felt were probably pre-mortem.
Right here is where my daddy used to live, and right over here is where he drowned Doreen. Just held her under the water until she had drowned it, and then he hit the baby in the back of the head and hatchet after he had raped her. He said that he just could not resist raping the baby. He said he just couldn't resist it.
You see this hole here, stump hole? That's an example. Something like that, he just stuffed the body down in that hole. Just a small child. The reason he killed them is because the mother had been with a black man and the baby was half black and half white, and he just didn't believe in that. And
that was his reason for doing away with them.
Eventually, Gaskins would reveal the truth about the disappearance of schoolgirl Kim Gelkins.
Kim was buried almost in our backyard. Right out in here is where they found Kim Gelkins. She walked out my front door, and I never seen her again. He took her off from the house and killed her.
Eight years after he had killed her, Gaskins finally gave up the body of his niece, 15-year-old Janice Kirby.
This is the grave site where his niece, Janice Kirby, was buried. He killed her in 1970, and her body was recovered in 1978. Dealing with a child or a small kid, that's tough to take. It's hard not to get involved. Just a little girl here. She's just a young teenager, really. Life snuffed out, stuck in a hole in the woods. Nobody knew where she was, what happened to her.
Investigators would ultimately discover the remains of 13 victims. A body count that made Pee Wee Gaskins the biggest mass murderer in the history of South Carolina. But in prison, Gaskins would make an even more shocking claim.
I just shivered. I mean, I said, Daddy, I don't want to hear this. And he would say, have fun, I need to get it off my chest. I need to tell somebody.
Gaskins is going to claim that he murdered some 80 to 90 young people, torturing them, then prolonging their death, torturing them again, and then hiding their bodies.
He allegedly started in 1969, killing young women primarily, later young boys and young women, along the coast.
He used to travel up and down the road and pick up hitchhikers, and he would torture them.
He always talked about dumping their nude bodies into marsh areas and sinking them deep enough so that it'd be unlikely for people to be able to find them.
Gaskins, if we take his word seriously, is clearly a process-focused serial killer. He's someone who wants to be with the victim to experience the terror that the victim is experiencing for as long as possible. Gaskins, for example, would often describe going into a hardware store and eyeing up particular tools that he felt he would be able to torture his victims with for longer. We're dealing with a very, very cunning predator who is quite clearly also a sexual sadist and a psychopath.
He alleged that he did 10 or 12 a year. Practically every month he'd kill somebody along the beach.
He said every so often he would get this urge that he would have to see blood. He called himself a vampire. He said his stomach would get to hurting. He said he would just get tied up in knots. He said he just couldn't be still. He would just tremble all over, and it would not stop until he killed somebody.
Serial murderers will tell you that there is something inside of them that they have to go kill. And that's common among serial murderers. It's almost like somebody who's almost so anxious that if they don't do something, they're going to break into a billion pieces. It's a little scary to say that a serial murderer is an addict, but if you really look at it in that context, in a way they are an addict. They have to do it. They have to do it.
Donald Pee Wee Gaskins wouldn't even let being in maximum security prison prevent him from taking human life. In 1982, he would plan a murder that was thought to be impossible. No one had believed hearse-driving criminal Donald Pee Wee Gaskins when he'd boasted of having his own private cemetery in rural South Carolina. But in the 1970s, detectives had been led to the graves of 13 of his victims, and Gaskins would claim there were more than 90 others still undiscovered. So who was Pee Wee Gaskins?
Most of my family was good Christian people. I mean, my daddy's the only person I know in my family that ever got in any trouble. He did enough for everybody.
Donald Gaskins Jr. was born on March the 13th, 1933, to an unmarried mother.
My daddy was a bad boy when he was little. My grandma said he was always doing something he wasn't supposed to do. And, you know, he used to get a whipping a lot. But, you know, my grandma was a very good woman. She was very good to him. But her brothers was a little bit hard on him. They used to beat him a lot because he wouldn't listen.
Gaskins' childhood was punctuated by a series of stepfathers in his life. He never knew his own father, and his mother had a series of relationships. Gaskins' childhood was also characterized by physical abuse, both at home and especially at school.
Gaskins was a peewee, he was a small guy, and so many individuals who live that lifestyle and that culture have to compensate for their small stature and overcompensate by trying to demonstrate how tough he is, how aggressive he is, to gain a reputation. And Gaskins was pretty good at that.
Gaskins dropped out of school at 11, forming a gang with two friends. Together, they dubbed themselves the Trouble Trio.
What they would do would be burglarize places, assault people, they would rob.
Here we've got a boy who is clearly what criminologists would call being involved in differential association. In other words, he's going to gain status, not through having peers who are going to do well at school, but instead he's going to gain status through associating with boys through committing crime. Initially petty crime, but that would degenerate. Gaskins would eventually commit a sexual offense, a rape.
I know Daddy and his two friends, they raped one of the boys' sisters.
Together, the Trouble Trio had lured the girl to their hideout and taken it in turns to rape her.
And they used to, you know, get together and do all kind of mean things together.
In 1946, aged just 13, Gaskins would graduate from rape to attempted murder. Whilst burglarizing a house, Gaskins was disturbed by a young girl.
He hit her in the head with an axe and left her on the ditch bank, thinking she was dead.
The only thing that kept her alive was there was a little bit of water trickling through there, and it kept her alive till someone found her, or she would have died.
The girl was able to identify her attacker. The juvenile Pee Wee was sent to reform school until his 18th birthday.
In our area, the industrial school for boys was a place where kids who got in trouble, they went and they made them work on the farm and this sort of stuff. I don't think they mistreated them, but they made them work hard.
The diminutive Gaskins claimed that on his second night in custody, he was ambushed in the showers and gang raped by 20 boys. He would have to accept the protection of the dormitory's boss boy in return for sexual services.
Daddy was a really tiny, tiny person. And, you know, the bigger boys picked on him.
You've always got bullies everywhere.
Well, what often happens, as often happens in prison settings, is that you're put in with a group of individuals who are generally worse than you are. Very frequently, they were quite brutal.
Over the next 4 years, Gaskins would run away repeatedly. But in 1950, he was due for release.
I'm holding in my hands a report, February 28, 1950. It says, Dear Dr. Odom, the subject was committed to this institution on June 18, 1946 by the Court of General Sessions, the Criminal Court of Florence County, under an indictment for assault and battery with intent to kill. We are not attempting any diagnosis, but we are sure from our dealings with abnormal delinquents that this boy is antisocial and there's something in his past development that is preying upon his mind. We consider him dangerous and also believe he has the homicidal tendencies peculiar to a paranoid type. We are requesting psychiatric treatment and requesting proper placement in view of the fact that we have been unable to adjust this boy to our group.
On his 18th birthday, Donald Pee Wee Gaskins was set free. His criminal activities took up where he'd left off.
When he got out of reform school, he got a job working for a tobacco farmer. And what he would do would be to steal the tobacco and sell it. And then he set fire to the barn to cover up the theft.
After just 1 year as a free man, Gaskins is teased by a teenage girl and strikes out.
All through his life, you can see that Gaskins is particularly angry at women. Now, perhaps we can date that back to the fact that his mother was a single mother, that Gaskins never knew his father, that there were multiple stepfathers. But for whatever reasons, Gaskins shows throughout his life a great deal of hostility towards girls and towards women. And this poor girl who taunts Gaskins about burning down the barns sees his wrath and has her skull opened up by Gaskins hitting her with a hammer.
Gaskins is convicted of arson, assault with a deadly weapon, and attempted murder, and sent to the state penitentiary. Here, a group of feared convicts, known as Power Men, made the rules. Gaskins was chosen by one such violent convict as a sex slave.
And Gaskins realizes that if he wants to avoid being sexually abused for the length of his sentence, he too has to become a power man.
Gaskins approached the most feared power man in the prison and slit his throat.
In the rules of that particular jail, he's elevated to the top, he becomes a face within that particular penal subculture, and he serves the rest of his time with notoriety, someone not to be messed with. And that really, I think, is the beginnings of Gaskin overcoming these childhood problems about his size and actually using the fact that he's small but dangerous to his own advantage.
When he got older and, you know, had guns and stuff, he figured, hey, I can be a big man now.
Gaskins would spend the next 2 decades in and out of prison, frequently escaping and being recaptured.
These woods out here is where my daddy would always run. All these woods connect in some way. And I mean, he'd stay out here for months at a time when he'd escape from prison. Eating snakes, he'd eat rattlesnake. He would take water out of ditches and stuff and boil it and drink it.
He was up in the courthouse, in the old courthouse for trial, and they put him in the waiting room, and while he was in there, he pushed the window up and jumped out the second story window and escaped. He went into the swamp, and they put the bloodhounds on his trail. And a couple of the deputies back then took a little nap while they were waiting on him, and they woke up and found that he had written on the back of the windshield that Pee Wee was here in the dew.
I mean, you could hide out for a long, long time out here. And people scared out here because of the snake infestation. They didn't scare him. I mean, Dad said he used to sleep with the snakes.
During his times out of prison, Gaskins would frequently take up with a new wife.
Here you see in these multiple sexual partners that Gaskins pursues, normally younger women, you begin to see some of the psychopathy in Gaskins' character emerging. He's the classic psychopath who will use women as opposed to forming serious relationships with women. And partly that's about reflecting his hatred of women.
Then in 1970, the disappearances began.
He kept bringing people to my house, and, you know, he would say, well, he called me Half Pint. He said, Half Pint. He said, will you fix this one so-and-so something to eat? And I would do it, but, you know, they would leave and never come back. I would never see them again. He came home a couple of times with blood on his hands. And, you know, I'd ask him, he said, well, I hit a deer or something like that. But people started missing, you know, and not coming back. And I knew something. I knew something was wrong.
By the end of the 70s, Gaskins had been tied to 13 murders and was in maximum security prison serving life. But in 1982, he determined to add to his total, planning a murder on death row that most thought impossible. In 1982, serial killer Donald Pee Wee Gaskins, while serving a life sentence in South Carolina's maximum security prison, set his sights on another victim.
The final murder that Gaskins commits, he commits in the most extraordinary circumstances.
His target, a fellow inmate housed in solitary confinement on death row.
Rudolph Tyner was semi-retarded. I mean, very low IQ guy from New York. He was passing through South Carolina when he and some others decided to rob the Moons. They had a convenience store down on the coast.
He had already left the store, turned around and went back in the store and shot them both each in the head with a sawed-off shotgun.
The deceased couple's son, Tony Simo, wanted justice.
Tony Simo, he was the adopted son of these folks. They treated him great. He was very emotional about this.
Although sentenced to death, Tyner had avoided execution for years.
There were some procedural problems. Simo, the son, after I think it had been 6 or 7 years, just lost patience. And he'd been sentenced to death twice. Time to get on with it.
Tony was friends with someone in prison. They got Daddy and Tony together.
Can I help you? My brother is Collector Tony. My name is Gerald McCormick.
Thank you.
Hello?
I have a customer call to Tony from Joe McCormick. Will you accept?
Yes, I will.
Thank you. Are you Tony?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Tony? Yeah. Gerald wanted me to call you. Said, tell you this is the doctor calling you.
The Moons' son and stepson hired Pee Wee to kill Rudolph Tyner.
Tyner was housed in solitary confinement in the state's most secure prison.
I went to the authorities and I told them that Daddy was planning on, you know, killing someone in there, and they told me there was no way that he could do it. that, you know, it was impossible.
Initially, he befriended Tyner and took him food and marijuana and whatever he wanted. And they smuggled in some poison. It didn't work, made him sick.
We give that son of a bitch all of it but one dose, and all it is doing is making that son of a bitch sick. We put it in some damn book for him to drink the other night. He drank, and 2 more drank, and all it was made all 3 of them sick as hell.
With poison not working, Pee Wee Gaskins comes up with an ingenious plan to end the life of Rudolph Tyner.
They had made him a maintenance man with all the tools he wanted.
And the back of his cell backed up to Tyner's cell.
Gaskins suggests to Tyner that he wants to have a communication system between their cells, almost like a telephone system.
I come up with something, there can't be no damn making sick on it. I need 1 electric cap and as much of a stick of damn dynamite as you can get. Okay, well, I'll probably get you at least plastic explosive. Well, that'd be good.
This is an actual cup that they used in the Department of Corrections at the time. They had this size and they had a bigger size. Pee Wee took one of these and melted a hole in the bottom of it with a soldering iron and put in a female plug, like you'd plug in headphones, for instance. On the other end of that, he attached the blasting cap, nestled it in the C4 explosive.
Was able to feed it through the wall, through the vent into Tyner, and under the guise of it being an intercom type system.
I'll take a damn radio and rig it into a bum, and when he plugs that son of a bitch up, it'll blow him on into hell.
He told Tyner to, if he asked him if he could hear him, hold it up to his ear, and then he plugged the other end into the 110 socket.
Just listen for the bang.
He blowed him up.
Pieces of him were blown all over the prison. Fingers went everywhere. Pee Wee then pulled the wire back through the vent, clipped it up, flushed it down the toilet, and came out and, what's going on?
I mean, it was just kind of astonishing that all that was able to happen in the penitentiary. The only good thing about that was that, you know, that was a crime that he could get the death penalty for at that time.
Pee Wee had recorded his phone calls with Tony Simo, planning to later blackmail him. But investigators discovered the tapes, and Pee Wee was convicted of Tyner's murder and sentenced to death. So was Donald Pee Wee Gaskins a born killer?
This is a 1964 report when he's again committed on another crime. And they talked to his mother. The patient's mother said the patient did have a lot of physical difficulties as a young child. When he was about a year old, he drank some kerosene and almost died. The doctor who treated him said his nerves would be bad for the rest of his life. After this incident, the patient began to have convulsions and would remain unconscious for as long as 10 minutes at a time. Ms. Hannah said the patient had convulsions until he was about 3 years old. He had bad dreams, often wake up in the middle of the night and be afraid. Ms. Hannah said she had to sleep with him until he was about 13 years old. His mother thinks that kerosene drinking early on was the cause of his problems. I don't know.
It's become a very popular thing to talk about how concussions can change personalities and can change people's behavior, can make them more aggressive and more assertive. But if it were true that brain trauma had something to do with aggression, we would expect that every serial murderer would have had some type of brain trauma or brain insult, and that doesn't happen.
Gaskins is an individual who's had an antisocial life since he was a child. He began with some sort of a small gang that did all sorts of antisocial and criminal sorts of things. And he's very, very comfortable not only with committing crime, but with killing. It means absolutely nothing to him.
The pattern of Gaskins' life has been of a boy who who learned how to commit crime and to commit more sophisticated crimes. It's the pattern of a life whereby a boy learns how to be a power man by using violence to ensure that he gets his way in the world. But that doesn't mean to say that I think that Gaskins was born to kill. This is somebody who was socialized into killing.
Whatever gene there is in a human being that gives them compassion, he lacked.
A lot of people says my daddy didn't have a conscience, that he could not regret what he had done. So, I mean, I don't know, but he never said he was sorry that he killed anybody. I think he was born to kill. I really do. I think my daddy was sick. I think my daddy had a split personality. My daddy always, I mean, ever since I can remember, always loved to kill something.
Gaskins would go to the electric chair, professing to be the single most prolific serial killer in American history. But did the 80 to 90 young hitchhikers he claimed to have killed along the coast actually exist?
The coastal killings. I personally don't believe any of that's true. We've never had any physical evidence or rumor or conjecture from anybody that, you know, my niece or my nephew or any of my kin people are missing, been missing for so long, and then last seen with Pee Wee, like we have with some of the others. I don't believe that happened.
If there had been any more victims, he would have called me and tried to work out a deal to where, you know, he wanted to go out and look for a body and show us a body. And there just wasn't anything there for it.
It's amazing. It's extremely difficult to weight a body down with enough weight for it not to bloat as it decomposes and float up. But now, in the areas he's talking about putting them, it certainly could have floated up, decomposed the rest of the way, become skeletonized, and sink back down. And so it's certainly possible that it would not be seen.
Without corroboration. Could he have killed 100 people? Sure, he could have. But he would be an outlier. That's a very, very high number of victims, even for a prolific serial killer. But since he is so inadequate and has to compensate constantly his entire life, to lie and exaggerate your killings wouldn't surprise me at all. That would be very consistent with his personality. It's possible, but not probable.
Everything my daddy said was true. I could tell when my daddy was telling a lie. I could tell. There's something about his face that I could tell. The total amount is 105 people.
He wanted just to be notorious. He wanted people to think he was the baddest thing ever to live in South Carolina. I think he was pretty close to the top.
This is where my daddy's ashes is scattered right here. He wanted me to put him here because this was his old stomping ground, and we couldn't bury him because people was trying to steal his body because they said that he was the devil's son, and they wanted to worship it. He's in right in here, right in here. I mean, I'll always love my dad. I mean, he was my dad. You know, that's something you can't change, and you can't stop love. If you love somebody, you love them, and you know, I love my daddy. No matter what he done, and I didn't agree with him because I testified against him, I'll always love my daddy.